my friends, welcome back to Player Display for another PODguy PODcast. So, we're going to do something today that I've been wanting to do for a very, very long time, especially after all the other podcasts that we have done in the past. We've been discussing a lot of characters from films, the films themselves, video games here and there, just a whole slathering of different topics, but one that keeps popping up, including in the action figure reviews as well, is my absolute adoration for one of the worst, quote-unquote, worst movies of all time, being 1997's Batman and Robin, which I highlight, at least at this moment in time, as my favorite superhero genre movie ever made. And that is something I've said on multiple occasions. It has, I think, my favorite supervillain in this movie, at least based on the comics, and those are sentiments that haven't really melted away. Like, I've said them in the moment, but they have longevity. Those opinions still stick with me. I was never saying it just to say it, or like, it just felt like, I'm in the right mindset, therefore, okay, right now it feels like it is my favorite movie. But as time has gone on, I'd realized it's an all-timer for me. It sticks around. As I keep looking at the legacy of superhero films and what they mean to me, what they mean to others, Batman and Robin sticks out. And at the same time, it's one of the most hated on films that's ever been produced. Like, to this day, decades later, people still highlight this as not just one of the worst comic book movies, but one of the worst movies. And I can't personally comprehend that. I do understand it on certain levels, but ultimately, I love this movie. And I wanted to simply go over the reasons why I think this movie is actually great. Not the best Batman movie, mind you. I think that the best Batman movie is The Batman, the recently released Matt Reeves one. But I think Batman and Robin is a very good Batman film. So if any of you hate this movie and you're listening to this podcast, it might not be for you. But if you want to get a new opinion from one of the few people who actually does stand with this movie, then it might not be a bad podcast to listen to. So that's what we'll be talking about today. I have a whole bunch of little bullet points here, which I rarely have with whenever I'm doing these podcasts. I usually just start talking, but this is kind of a partial audio essay, if you will, so there are certain points I do really want to hit to support my point, and why I'm trying to say that this is indeed a good Batman movie. So anyways, before you get into Batman and Robin, I just wanted to start out by talking about my experience with Batman, like how I got started on the Batman hype, how it all began for me, where it currently is, and all that. Just give a general timeline. It'll be quick. But basically, if you ask most people, like, where did you first start with Batman, most folks will probably say, oh, the comics, or, oh, 1989 Tim Burton Batman, or perhaps even Adam West, or if you're talking to a real old-timer, then they'll say the two serials that came out in the 40s. So there's a lot of places where people start with their Batman experience. Growing up, for the most part, I was a Spider-Man kid, but still in the background, Batman was operating. And it didn't begin for me with any of the comics, shows, or movies. It actually began with the Lego Batman video game from 2007. I went over to a neighborhood kid's house. He pulled out a Wii because we were living in the late 2010s, and he just ran Lego Batman. I had no idea what to expect, didn't know it even existed. He just had a cool game. I like the Lego Star Wars game, so obviously this game couldn't be too bad either. So played a little bit of the game for like under an hour, I think, and immediately I fell in love with it. I loved all the crazy characters, I loved the gameplay, I loved the graphics at the time, so eventually got my own copy of it, and I played through the entire thing on my really crappy potato-ass computer that I had at the time. It is one of my milestone video games, and it is, as I said, my first ever Batman experience. So my parents were seeing me just play these Lego games over and over again, and they start to notice, oh, he really likes Batman. Maybe it would help if he actually watched Batman for once. So my parents actually got me the 4-movie set of the Batman films, the Batman quadrilogy, as I like to call it. Others might not want to call it the Batman quadrilogy, but that's why I prefer to call it. The 2 Burton films and the 2 Schumacher films. Obviously, I buzzed through all of them, and I enjoyed them all. Being a kid, I didn't really have any strong opinions on anything. I wasn't particularly critical on any aspects of either film. I was just simply watching them to have fun. And to this day, I think that all 4 are thoroughly fun films at the base level. They're all enjoyable, they still hold up, and, you know, you pull me from the couch, you're like, hey, want to watch this movie or this movie from this quadrilogy? I'm like, yeah, I'm down. Like, I enjoy all of them thoroughly. I mean, to varying degrees and for very different reasons, but I still enjoy them. So, like, for Batman 89, I mean, that's where it all began, for my cinematic Batman experience. Very fun film, not the most complex. I mean, it's very direct. You got a hero, you got a villain, then the hero defeats the villain. It's a pretty straightforward story, but it's fun to play out. It's great to see the Batman archetype in action, at least for me, this was the first time, and just to see Tim Burton's gothic atmosphere almost have this perfect marriage with Batman and Gotham. I mean, goth isn't the word, so it makes perfect sense. And yeah, it's just a great little world that was set up. And then it continued on in Batman Returns, where you get Batman, once again, as portrayed by Michael Keaton, and then you have 2 new villains in the form of Penguin and Catwoman. And that was also a fun film. I'd agree. I'd say it's a little bit muddy. I think there's too many arcs happening at once. I wish it would have a little bit more of a focus and more of a cathartic ending. It did feel like it had a little bit too much of that to be continued syndrome that a lot of modern comic book movies have. Like, you feel like, oh, cool, so Catwoman's still around. Batman and Catwoman haven't really tied the knot, but we're gonna at some point see them be a couple and fight crime together, right? No, we got Batman Forever instead. And this is, of course, where a lot of people dip out. This is where you get a total direction change. Now Batman is in the hands of Joel Schumacher. This movie I did not like as much as the Burton ones, but it was still fun. I mean, you had Jim Carrey doing his Riddler shtick, then you got Two-Face just blowing things up. It's still an enjoyable time. Then I also got to Batman and Robin after that. And again, I wasn't thinking, oh, I love this movie, or oh, I hate this movie. I was just thinking, this is another fun Batman adventure, and not a whole lot more than that. So, again, as a kid, wasn't a critic at that point in time. I was just enjoying these movies as they came along. Then later on in life, I eventually got around to the Dark Knight films. I watched none of them in theaters whatsoever. I watched all of them at some point or another on DVD, or if they ran on TV or something like that. And honestly, I never loved those films. For me, again, you had the Lego Batman game, then you had the original Batman quadrilogy. For me, those were my Batman sources. For me, Batman was always more fantastical, more fun, had a little bit more color to them. And then when you get to the Dark Knight films, again, I totally understand why people love and adore these movies, but for me, they've always been too dry, not fun enough, taking itself, no pun intended, too seriously. And I just never found myself in love with those films. I really wish that I would be, but I'm just not. So, and then you got the Lego Batman movie, that's a whole ton of fun. And then you got Batman vs. Superman, then it goes into the cinematic universe stuff, which I, in general, just don't count for my personal experience. If you like MCU or DCEU, that's totally cool, but that's kind of where I dip off. I love the isolated, titular superhero movies that just strictly focus on a single hero, and then we follow their journey from there. So I love most of the superhero movies from before the cinematic universe stuff started happening. I mean, it has its fun moments, but overall, I prefer just the isolated microcosms that we get in these initial films, being the Burton Batman, being the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, Andrew Garfield Spider-Man as well. But then once you get into the MCU, DCEU, that's where I kind of trail off and I'm just no longer invested. But anyways, as I went through my life, hopping from Batman movie to Batman movie, my opinions changing and changing. Initially, Batman Returns was my favorite, I think. And then that's how it remained for a good long time. Then I think I dipped back a little bit and I said, you know what, no, I think I prefer Batman 89 more. They also had a Batman Forever phase for a time. But then something really interesting happened. When I graduated from college in 2021, I started my first full-time job. I was very far away from the few friends that I had. To make a long story short, times sucked bad. It was a really rough year and a half. It was a long stretch. And there were a few things that did help to get me out of that stretch, primarily in the form of movies. That's the easiest way to get yourself out of the funk. Like, for me, I think one of the big ones, in a totally separate podcast, two that we've done actually, were the VHS movies. I'm a sucker for those films. I think another one's coming out this year, maybe next year. I'm really looking forward to those, but I consider those like my therapy movies. If I'm having a shitty time, I watch the VHS movies. But I also went back to the Batman films because The Batman was coming out. And my dad and I, we wanted to rewatch the entire Batman quadrilogy, kind of just reevaluate them, like, hey, we're both adults now, let's just see what we think about them. My dad wasn't as enthused as he once was. He was a little bit more cynical, and rightfully so. The movies, all of them have their flaws, they're not perfect, they do have some issues. But for me, as I was going through, I started to realize I actually enjoyed the atmosphere of the Schumacher movies more than the Burton ones. Not to say that I dislike the Burton atmosphere, I think it's fantastic, but when I got to the Schumacher movies, I found that simply I was enjoying them more than I ever had before. Especially Batman and Robin, and I think that's simply because I enjoy the story more, I enjoy the characters more. So this movie, it stuck to me like glue. Especially in this very sensitive time in my life, but even now, being out of that funk, I'm still rewatching the movie. I just rewatched it an hour ago, and within that hour, I was typing up the notes to make this podcast. That's how impulsive it was. But anyways, that's what leads me to this point today. So, what this movie is, to start us off, it's a genre film. It's like one of those... Schumacher's one of those directors that not everybody is going to love. Like Paul Verhoeven's another one, Baz Luhrmann's another one. I'd say even Tim Burton to an extent. They've got a style. You're either gonna love the style, or you're gonna hate the style. I don't think there's ever gonna be that type of person who's like, oh, that was kind of neat, alright, move on to the next thing. Like, you're gonna have a strong opinion one way or another. All the directors I just mentioned, I love them all thoroughly. But I could see people who watch these films and they're just like, I don't like this at all. Like, I've heard people who are determined Burton protesters who do not like his gothic style at all because they feel like it's overused, it's too edgy, too grim, not enough brevity in there. And I get that. I mean, it doesn't apply to me personally, but I see why people dislike the Burton movies. Because they have such a unique style in them. And then you get to Schumacher with his two Batman films, and I absolutely adore them. Again, let's focus more on Batman and Robin. We could talk about Forever another time, but Batman and Robin is the one that I care about the most, so that's what we're talking about. This movie's really interesting because it's like three things at once. It's a sequel, a reboot, and a parody. It's a sequel because, obviously, there's three movies behind it, if you exclude the Adam West 66 one, naturally, because that's decades behind. It's not at all part of this quadrilogy, but you had Batman 89, then you had Returns, then you had Forever, then you got Batman and Robin, so it's a sequel. But it's also a partial reboot. I'd say Forever is more so the reboot because you got a new director in there. It doesn't really talk about the previous movies too much. I think the only instance where it does is where Chase Meridian alludes to Batman's past with Catwoman, but that's pretty much it. Like, there's no mention of the Joker or even Penguin at all. As soon as Schumacher came into the picture, the two Burton movies, they're no longer strictly canon. They can or cannot be. You could take them or leave them. Depends on how you headcanon everything. I headcanon them all as 4 movies that are part of the same story, but ultimately, Batman and Robin is a continuation of a reboot. And the third thing it is it's a parody within its own franchise. And again, this is a take it or leave it thing. You'll either love it for this very bold move that it's pulling, or you're really going to despise it. And for me, I really love it because I feel like it somehow creates this marriage between Adam West 66, then you got Tim Burton with the Gothic style, and then you got Joel Schumacher style, which we'll talk about more in depth later on. And somehow this one movie takes all 3 styles and puts them all together. To me, this is the legacy Batman movie, and that it's able to take the Gothic, the comedic, and the Schumacher and put it all into one thing. And I think it worked. A lot of people disagree with me, like 99% of the planet disagrees with me, but for me, I think that's one of the many, many things that makes this movie great. So, anyways, the way I've got this all structured out, yeah, we're not even into the thick of it, that was all the prelude. The way I've got the rest of this podcast planned out, is we're first going to talk about the individual characters. I think that's a good place to start. Then we're going to go into the general themes that this movie has, and then we're also going to talk about the negatives, because there are still negatives. I'm not that one-sided about this movie. And then also some of the positives that you might have never really considered before. So let's start out with the heroes of this movie, because there are several heroes, arguably too many. But again, I'm fine with it. Firstly, we have George Clooney's Batman, who everyone calls the worst Batman ever. And I pretty much disagree with that. I wouldn't say that he's the worst Batman. I'd say he's more so the most disappointing. Because he doesn't bring as much to the table as other Batmen have in the past, or have after that point. Like, I think Christian Bale's my personal least favorite, but he still brought more arc and themes to the character. And he had Batfleck, he brought his physicality and everything. And then obviously Robert Pattinson is really awesome. He brings us the first young Batman that we've seen in these films. So they all bring in a little bit of something at base level. As for George Clooney's Batman, he doesn't really add a ton to Batman in terms of his characterization quite as much, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't want to call George Clooney a placeholder, but effectively what George Clooney is meant to be is the same Batman that we've been seeing throughout the past 3 movies, being Michael Keaton and Val Kilmer. If we're assuming this is all a quadrilogy, then we have to assume that these 3 Batmen are all the same guy. And I think it works. You have a Batman who, we have to assume by this point, has already gone through all his trials. He's gone through most of his arcs by this point. He's simply the stoic father figure who is trying to lead Robin into the path of heroism, which you already kind of saw in Batman Forever, which also makes Batman Forever, in its own way, a very good film as well. So that's something we could talk about another time. I'm not as passionate about Forever, but if you'd like to see a podcast on that, then yeah, we could peel that apart as well. But I don't see people peeling apart Batman and Robin as much, so that's why we're here now. But anyways, I think the great thing about this particular Batman is how stoic he is. He's not that comedic. I mean, yeah, you got the bat nipples and the bat ass and all of that, but that's not the characterization of this Batman. In the way that he talks, in the way that he interacts with his environment, he's very stoic, he's very rigid, he's very matter-of-fact, he's never thrown off guard, And that's because he's very used to this shit. He lives in Gotham. He's fought the weirdest of the weird, the craziest of the crazy. So when he learns about Mr. Freeze, he's just like, Mr. Freeze. Like, another one of these freaks out there for me to take care of and to clean off the Gotham streets. And I think it works so well for this film, which is, again, a Schumacher film, which is going to, is going to escalate to become more and more erratic and insane. But then you still just got Batman in there, who's still just being his plain old self. And I think that works. He feels out of place from the rest of the world around him, because he already knows what's up, he already knows what he's getting into. Nothing going on is a particularly big deal, so George Clooney is pretty deadpan. And whether that's by intention or not, I do think it serves the movie well, depending on what situations that we're talking about throughout the film. Like, the only times where he really does get emotional at all is when he's back-talking Robin for becoming a little too independent, becoming a little bit too reckless, more on that later, and also when he redeems Mr. Freeze towards the end, and he gives an impassioned speech about what it means to be a true hero and to be a protector against death. Again, themes that we'll cover a little bit later on, but I think this Batman works. If you dislike this Batman, I do believe that this Batman functions well in this movie. Another great thing about this Batman, again, playing into the stoic nature of him, is he cannot hold on to a relationship. I think one critique that has been held against this movie is the fact that he has a love interest whose name I don't even remember, that's how insignificant she is, but at the same time, it makes sense. You've seen Batman, again, this is all one Batman here, you've seen Batman with Vicky Vale, but she kind of disappears to do her own career work, supposedly. I don't think they directly address that. Then, of course, he's with Catwoman for a time. She's a little too rogue, she kind of disappears off the map, and also things get rebooted with Schumacher, so she's gone. And then he's with Chase Meridian, who, more than anything, deep probes his brain, kind of gives him his first real arc in these movies, which is great, and then she kind of drives off, and then that's the last we see of her. Excuse me. So by this point, in Batman and Robin, he's with this other girl, and then when he's being interviewed and he's asked, when are you finally going to tie the knot? He's like, well, he's not prepared to answer that question. And I think he already knows the answer. I think he knows, like, this ain't gonna happen. I'm never gonna be in a relationship. There's too much going on in these rough nights that's going to prevent me from ever being able to hold a relationship. I'm too erratic, I'm too weird, I'm too nuts, of course. Again, same Batman here. So, for me, it works, the fact that he has no romantic connections at all in this film. I mean, then you got Ivy with her pheromone dust and all that, but that's kind of an aside point. Like, it's a seductive pheromone dust thing, so that doesn't really count. That's lust, not love, not deep connection, so that's aside from the point. Moving on with this Batman, he does indeed have an arc, something which is lacking with other Batman we've seen. Like, as great as Michael Keaton's Batman was at setting up the archetype, setting the mood, he doesn't really have a story arc. He isn't a new person by the end of either of his two films. I mean, now there's three, but we're not talking about Flash today. By this point, with these two films, he has no real arc in 89. He just learns that the Joker killed his parents, so he kills the Joker, pretty much. And that's that. Then in Batman Returns, he gets close to an arc. Like, he says that he and Catwoman can run away together, but she ultimately rejects him, and then they supposedly go their separate ways, so nothing really comes out of that. But then this is where he gives Schumacher a lot of credit, because in Batman Forever, even though it's tonally different, it's got different direction and everything, Batman finally has an arc about, now he's got his ward being Robin, and he's seeing Robin go through the same origin story. His family is murdered by a maniac, and he wants to make a turn towards vengeance, where Batman realizes, thanks to Chase Meridian, that he needs to steer him in the right direction. So he has a very distinct arc in Forever, and he'd probably have an even greater one in the Schumacher cut, which hopefully we get one day. And then in Batman and Robin, it kind of continues that theme of him trying to protect Robin, but here he's being a little overprotective. He's not allowing Robin to take risks. He's not allowing Robin to be his own hero. He keeps saving him. He keeps being that parent in the car where you got the guy behind the wheel, and then as soon as they hit the brakes, the parent extends their arm and then pulls him back against the chair, you know? Like, that whole archetype. That's pretty much who he is at this point. And he keeps trying to justify his actions. He's too proud to admit that he's wrong. But ultimately, he comes around to Robin, and he says what you were talking about before about being independent and everything. It wasn't just being about independence, but about teamwork, allowing someone else to take the fall or move on their own. So when it comes to the final confrontation, spoiler alert, I'm sure you've already seen the movie by this point, but when it comes to the final confrontation with Mr. Freeze and Ivy, they've got this very distinct plan of Batman kind of first letting Robin leading the charge, then Batman comes in around to give some support, and then they're helped up by Batgirl. That's a whole other tangent. But then when they go to confront Freeze, that's when Batman says, alright, Robin, you go take care of Bane, I'll go take care of Mr. Freeze. So they attack the same problem from different angles to ultimately solve it together. Sometimes they win just by luck. That's a fair criticism of the film. But ultimately, his catharsis is that he learns to allow Robin to operate as an equal within the same mission, and not to be holding his hand the whole time. And the last really great thing about Batman in this movie, there's several good things, other talking points about him, but I just want to pull out the highlights here. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and we'll go more in depth on this later, is how he redeems a villain. Try and think about another time in these Batman movies, let alone superhero movies, where the hero redeems a villain and makes him into a better person. This is the only time I can recall where Batman has redeemed a villain almost completely in one of these films. I mean, he kills the Joker, he kind of lets Penguin destroy himself, he kind of just lets Catwoman go. It doesn't really cause a change in her. She's kind of just off. And then the rest is left to the imagination. He imprisons Riddler. He basically kills Two-Face. He imprisons Ivy, or rather, Batgirl does that more so. Bane's left for dead, so Batman has no involvement there. But for Freeze, it's different. Batman actually goes to Freeze's side, tells him the truth about his wife, and he says that you're still a doctor under this suit. You were made to save lives, not to take them. Don't fall into Ivy's delusions. And Freeze is redeemed. He's a new man from this. Or rather, he's the man that he used to be. And that's a really beautiful thing. I think that's what makes this one of the better Batman movies, because they see Batman redeeming a villain. And for me, I think that's a perfect ending to this quadrilogy. The fact that he's not trying to destroy the villain or imprison them, he's actually trying to talk them through it and make them better. So, more on that later. We'll talk more about that when we actually discuss Mr. Freeze himself. But as for other heroes in this film, we won't have as much to say here. But we talked already about Robin. He's still very amateurish, very childish, turned on by every single woman that he sees. He's still a kid in this. He's still very much an apprentice to Batman. Still learning, still making mistakes, a lot of hubris, very good archetype there, and it works for his character. And for this reason, because of his characterization, we understand why Batman feels the need to take up so much control, because Robin is still kind of a wild card. He still tries doing stupid things in order to save the day, like driving the scooter off that giant statue's arm, which wouldn't have panned out he would have fallen to his death. That's a time where Batman was actually correct. Where he wasn't correct was in shutting down his bike and letting Robin learn his lesson. He probably would have been able to save himself with the many grappling guns that they have throughout this movie, but Batman should have let him learn his lesson by falling first. So that's the moral there. But even so, Robin still learns the meaning and value of teamwork. Initially, he was like, I'm going solo, it's your way or the highway, I'm going to do my own thing, and then he's pretty much like wanting to be Nightwing at this point. I mean, Nightwing's name was dropped in Forever, so that is in the cards. He could have become Nightwing in this quadrilogy, which would have been really cool. But ultimately, he learns that it's not being independent that's going to make him a better hero, but rather teamwork, family, developing a plan together, and attacking a problem from different angles. So, again, we already talked about that with Batman, but that's what makes his character so good. And I also really love Chris O'Donnell. I think he does a bang-up job as Robin, just being this very amateur kid who is properly situated behind Batman. Still got a lot to learn. He's not a full-fledged hero yet. He's still realizing when it's the right time to call the shots, when it's the right time to be defiant, or when he should lend an open ear and actually listen to someone who's already been through it a bit. Our next hero is Batgirl. She's a character who is underplayed by most. Not a whole lot of people talk about her, but she still has an arc, believe it or not. Her whole thing, the whole reason why she visited Wayne Manor, is to track down Alfred, because she is a relative to Alfred, and she does not like what she sees as a life of servitude. He's been serving the Waynes, Bruce's parents and Bruce himself, pretty much all his life, as far as we know. And she's not a fan of that. She's like, this isn't a life for a person. You shouldn't be just serving somebody for as long as you live. You should find your own freedom. So she's going to these drag races to get enough money to buy his freedom. And what she realizes towards the end of the film is that, I guess Alfred already assumed that she would be too nosy to not let a secret just pass by. So when he hands her the flash drive and says strictly, don't look into this, pass it straight on to Wilfred, who is never talked about at all. That's another little critique in there. But I almost feel like that seed was planted. Like, he planted that disc on her specifically knowing that she would have to open it up. You know, like the kid in the cookie jar. Don't open the cookie jar. Kid's gonna open the cookie jar. So when she arrives initially at Wayne Manor, he fully expects that eventually, just by matter of circumstance, she's going to be part of the Bat family at the end of the day. So he builds her a suit she eventually stumbles onto the Batcave, and he's full well and ready to make a hero out of her. And while they could have addressed it better, I think this is where she realizes that this isn't Alfred's slavery. This is his choice to be with this family. The family is his own passion. So I think that's what the suit teaches her. They could have done a better job addressing that, but I do think that it's not just simply making her part of the team, but making her part of the family, which Alfred values above all else. And she realizes that his life is not hers to control. And last hero of this film, there is one more, is Alfred. Wouldn't you know it? Some people forget. Alfred is, in him of himself, a hero of this story. Of course he can't do any of the fighting, but not all heroes wear capes, not all heroes can fight, and not many people probably even know that Alfred even exists. Just Bruce, Robin, and Barbara, and that's it. But he, throughout the entire film, I think in some of the best moments in the movie, he's having these moments with Bruce where he's trying to tell him to ease off a little bit, back off of Robin, let him learn on his own. Like, let him fall so he can pick himself back up. Let him learn these lessons himself. And he also makes preparations for Batgirl on the side, and I think one of the most important things that he says is, what is Batman but an effort to prevent death itself? And that really just speaks to the mythos of Batman. Like, what does Batman mean in these 4 movies? What is he trying to do? What is he trying to accomplish? And I think that's another part of Batman's arc. Realizing that he's not just a crime fighter, he's not just a murderer of villains, he's a protector, he's a savior of Gotham, right? And I think it's through these talks with Alfred that he indirectly realizes that Mr. Freeze can be saved. That he's not strictly a villain. Again, more on that later. But yeah, Alfred ultimately gears Batman, whether he knows it or not, into being a true hero. Someone who saves. And doesn't simply knock someone down when they made a mistake or punishes them. Alfred tells Batman that it's time to loosen up a little bit. Let people make their own decisions, and let them turn to be the good man that you are, in their own time. Because people don't always have enough time. Like, Alfred doesn't have enough time. He's dying. He's got McGregor syndrome. So, whereas you have a man who doesn't have a whole lot of time, everyone else, all these new villains who have a new lease on life, and all these new heroes, they do have time. So it's not about just beating each other up to a pulp as fast as you can. It's about taking the time to figure each other out. And realizing the humanity and all the weirdness that everyone's engulfed in this strange world that they're all living in. So Alfred really, in a very silent and not loudly outspoken way, ties all of the heroes and villains together. And he's a great character in this film. He was great in the previous 3, though he comes to a head here, I think, because of his ailment, and because of how that contrasts with the youth that is had by the villains and the heroes. And on top of that, he not only welcomes a new family member into the fold, but he also tells somebody in the family to loosen their grip on another family member, being Batman to Robin. So, still within the family that he so passionately cares about, he's kind of showing you that there's not one strict way to do things. It's not all about family, it's not all about being punishing or restricting towards each other. It's kind of just letting the natural flow of things happen. Like, he built up Barbara's suit, kind of just knowing that, yeah, eventually she's going to find the Batcave, as Robin did, and also telling Batman to loosen up a little bit, like, make Robin have his own choices, have his own insurgency on these missions. So, yeah, again, it's a family theme. That's what we see across all 4 of these heroes, Batman, Robin, Batgirl, and Alfred. That's the theme here. It could be better handled. I do think that it could actually benefit from being a little bit more blatant, from being a little bit more outwardly spoken, but it is in there, and I really do appreciate that. So now let's talk about the villains. A shorter list, fortunately, but still a lot to talk about. We have Mr. Freeze, my favorite comic book villain of all time, probably. He is not a villain, though. That's an important thing to mention. That's the great thing about this character, and something that is usually lost with a lot of the modern villains, I think, is the fact that he has a motive in what he's doing. He's not just an agent of chaos. He's not an ambiguous foe. He's not just planted there to be there. He is out there for a reason. The only thing he wants to do is, we kind of talked about this before, but his only motive is to save his wife. He has no real ill will towards Gotham. He's a little sadistic, sure, but he doesn't take a particular amount of pleasure in just wreaking havoc. He just wants to get the diamonds to keep himself alive, but it's merely a side quest, so that way he can develop the cure to McGregor syndrome and save his wife. That's his ultimate goal. I don't think he cares about the fact that he himself suffers from a chronic illness. All he cares about is that his wife lives. So, when Ivy fakes well, it doesn't really fake, but attempts the murder of his wife. That's what tips him over to actually being a villain, to actually having hate for Gotham, hate for humanity in them of themselves, is through believing that one of the greatest heroes has killed the only person that he's ever cared about. That's what makes him snap, wanting to destroy Gotham and to destroy the entire planet, thus fulfilling Ivy's plans of mass extinction. But then obviously, again, you get the heroes, they run in, they save the day, as they always do. But the difference here is, again, Batman redeems him. Let's talk more about that. Not as much to say now, I kind of already covered a lot of it, but one thing I really did want to talk about is the fact that Mr. Freeze is constantly using puns. And a lot of whenever people talk about this movie, that's always the first thing they say. There's so many puns, so much ice and freeze and all of this shit. And that's what shuts them down immediately. But at the same time, there's something very thematic about these puns. The fact that this man, encased in an ice suit, is constantly spitting out snow puns, ice puns, freeze puns. It's almost like he's trying to cope with his current state of being by making jokes. Like dad jokes, almost. And it becomes all the more poetic when he's on the ground, defeated, exposed to the sun, he's got nothing left in him. But then Batman approaches him, and he says, "You're a good man, just buried deep within the snow." I quote, that's pretty much what he said. And it's almost like Batman is trying to speak Mr. Freeze's language to appeal to him, to appeal to the better man. And that's what redeems Mr. Freeze. Like seeing the hero of Gotham, who he initially thought was the villain, to his own story, seeing Batman make the effort to speak his own language, to step into his own world. Because every single character in this film is very much within their own world, that ultimately winds up alienating the worlds of others. So, for not just Batman in the movies, but for Batman as a character to step into somebody else's realm, into their own strange understanding of what the world is, and speaking to them in a way that they understand, that's great character growth. And it leads to a really beautiful redemption, which I think is, I don't want to say like underrated. I just think it goes totally unnoticed because it is quite literally buried deep within the snow. People are too focused on bat puns, bat nipples, and all of that. But thematically, it makes the relationship between the hero and the quote-unquote villain a lot more beautiful. It builds a really nice connection between the two that people don't go deep enough into this movie to even notice at all. So, I think that's one of the many reasons why Mr. Freeze is my favorite comic book villain, because he's three-dimensional. He's a villain, well, you know, like at face value, he is a villain, and he has an origin story, he has a motive, he falls even further, and then he's brought back by the hero, which you don't see very often, especially for Batman in the movies. Sorry about any background noise, plumbing and shit, so just ignore that. Now we also have Poison Ivy. Poison Ivy, meanwhile, is the true villain of this movie. Again, we talked about how she manipulated Mr. Freeze in order to bring the worst out of him. The first time she ever saw him, she likened him to being a god. That's a very bold statement, but basically she looked at this man and said, this is a guy who can get things done. This is a guy who can bring about the next apocalypse, so that way plants can overtake humanity. And a lot of people critique this movie because they think, oh, their plans are totally incompatible. Freeze wants to encase the planet in ice, and Ivy wants to encase the planet in plants. That's not true. Mr. Freeze doesn't want to freeze the planet until Ivy convinces him to do so. And assuming he succeeds, plants will still survive. Because in every mass extinction event, there's always going to be that very small percent that just barely makes it. And on top of that, you have two of the brightest minds in Gotham operating to ensure that happens. That's going to escalate its certainty. And I came up with a good image to propose that this could indeed work. I mean, why do you think there are so many lawnmowers, hedge trimmers? There's so much maintenance that goes on in front yards. Because you take those really beautiful lawns and you compare them to houses or buildings that have been left behind. They're covered in overgrowth. You got these little weeds, bugs flying everywhere. This overgrown grass that looks very uneven, although it's not. It's actually supposed to look uneven. That's what plants would do in this situation. If all humanity is dead because they can't survive in the cold temperatures, the plants that are able to survive, whether they're naturally geared to survive in the cold, or Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze genetically alter them to survive the cold, they will inevitably, very quickly, mind you, grow past the cold and survive. Just as they very quickly grow over unmaintained buildings, if you will. So, again, this is a fantasy movie, but technically, the plan would work. It would take a long time, but eventually, Ivy would realize her goal. So, that's what makes her such an interesting villain. Her really psycho-bonkers plan, again, it's totally fantastical. This whole thing is a live-action cartoon at its core, but her master plan is ultimately what causes an otherwise good man, being Mr. Freeze, to fall almost indefinitely. So, you do have a very good contrast between these two characters. In that you have one man who's just trying to do something good for his wife, and then you got Ivy who has this much bigger scheme, and then she tries bringing out the worst in him through taking away the one person who has ever mattered to him at all. And then the last villain, not as much to say here, we have Bane. You could do this whole movie without Bane, and nothing would change, but I still enjoy this Bane. I call him the teddy bear Bane for a reason. He's a grunt, he's a bulldog, he is as dumb as a sack of bricks, and a lot of people take issue with that because Bane in the comics, especially during the 90s when he was first introduced, is highly calculating, very smart, and he's the man who broke the bat, as we would see later on in The Dark Knight Rises, of course. We see it there. So when you get this iteration of Bane, it's a culture shock to people because they're like, well, Bane's not supposed to be this lumbering idiot. He's supposed to be brilliant. But the reason why I think this Bane canonically works with this world... Sorry, I tapped the mic, hope you didn't hear that. But the reason why this Bane works is because he's meant to be a super soldier in this universe. And they have the venom pumping through his brain, that's what gives him his strength, and seemingly makes him more stupid. And you gotta keep in mind, this is a prototype serum. This is a new formula that's meant to be sold to the masses to create more super soldiers. And it's also made by a guy who's not totally in his right mind, being that Dr. Jason or whoever he is. So, this is not meant to be the smart Bane. This is a prototype Bane. If there were to be a third Schumacher Batman movie, which is impossible because Schumacher is no longer with us, sadly, then I could see a future where you get a new Bane where the venom is perfected. And this Bane is extremely strong and very smart on top of that. So that could work. And it works in the context of this movie in that we have a prototypical Bane who is not yet up to snuff with the image of Bane that we would otherwise have in our heads from the comics, from The Dark Knight Rises, and from a whole bunch of other more accurate iterations of this Bane that we've seen before and since. So I allow this Bane, and I still love him. He's still hilarious to watch, and yeah, he's he's just enjoyable. There's no complexity to his character whatsoever, but I think in terms of the storytelling, he does function well. So I've got no issue with this Bane at all. Now, we've gone through all the characters. There are more of them, like Commissioner Gordon's totally underused. Who else is there? Again, you got the girlfriend of Bruce, who, as he talked about, she's not supposed to be neither here nor there, specifically because he can't hold a relationship, but yeah, they're not really part of this story at all. They're not important, so we're not going to talk about them. So, let me take a sip of water, as I always do at some point during these podcasts. And let's move on to some themes and motifs that we have throughout this movie. I got some interesting theories here, and some of them might surprise you. So, firstly, the puns. We already kind of talked about the puns already with Mr. Freeze. It still applies here. I mean, you have Freeze, and he's making all the ice puns, but people always forget that Batman actually isn't making a whole lot of the puns. Again, he's more straight and narrow, more stoic and everything. He's not really making a whole ton of jokes. It's more so Freeze, but also Poison Ivy. Both of them are the punny characters. Not really the others as much. But I think the reason why puns serve this movie so well, especially for the villains, is because you have two characters who have totally new lives because of some tragic incident. For Mr. Freeze, he fell into that cryogenic chamber, and then he also lost his wife to a horrible disease, and he keeps her in cryostasis. As for Poison Ivy, especially for Ivy, she has a new lease on life, in that she was pushed by Jason into a whole bunch of chemicals and plants, thus turning her into Ivy, from being initially just a nerdy and quirky Pamela Isley. So, it's really interesting in how you have these two characters, one who's ice-based and one who's plant-based, both being totally unhinged from reality, and both of them speak through puns. And I think they do this for very different reasons. I think Mr. Freeze, as I said, he uses puns in order to cope with his current state of being. It's almost ironic in a way. Like, he sees himself as a very tragic person, but he uses puns to add some brevity to it. Like, it's an ironic thing. He knows that his life is a total mess. He wants to forget that. So he uses himself as a joke. And that might make him feel a little bit better. As for Ivy, though, she uses puns for very different reasons. She uses it to embrace the maniac that she's become. To enforce the power that she has over men, over society, over the people, and eventually over the planet. Because, again, that's what her plan and states that she will eventually achieve. Planet dominion. Which, again, is a crazy plan if there's only 2 people left. But, again, she's more interested in the plant surviving. So, puns actually serve this movie really well when you think about what it does for the people who use the puns. And what they've been through, what they've gone through, and who they're becoming, and what they want. The next theme I wanted to talk about is Joel Schumacher's style in this film. Obviously, we first saw it in Batman Forever, but even that was a sedated version of what Schumacher's Batman was. Like, there's still a little bit of Tim Burton involvement in that film, so there's still a little bit of pullback. You weren't seeing the full Schumacheriness of this world that we would be seeing in Batman and Robin. In Batman and Robin, it goes full Schumacher. He takes full control. And on top of that, he's also tasked with the mission of looping in new suits, new vehicles, new character designs, to basically create one giant toy commercial. And that really informs the aesthetics of this movie. And you combine that with Schumacher's style that was already teased in Forever, which is already very vibrant and colorful, full of neon, just a lot of shiny everything. And no matter what you feel about the whole toy angle and everything, no matter what you think about Schumacher's style, again, thematically, it serves a quadrilogy very well. In the Burton movies, things are very drab, dark, covered in shadow, overcast, hidden under the silhouettes of tall buildings, very black and white, very gothic. And you see that again in 89 as well as in Batman Returns. But then as the movies progress with Schumacher, they get more and more colorful. They're colorful in Forever, and they're even more colorful in Batman and Robin. And you also have the contrast of the majority of the Burton movies taking place in nighttime, but in Batman and Robin, you actually have a good look at daytime a little bit more often. Same with Forever too, now I think about it. You have more sunshine. And I think when you combine all of this, the toy aesthetic, the Schumacher colors, the contrast between night and day, that thematically speaks to the idea that slowly Gotham is becoming a better place to live. It's becoming safer. It's becoming cleaner. Even though the few villains who are left are arguably more dangerous than the ones we've seen previously, there are fewer and lesser of them. But Gotham is actually being saved. Again, I didn't think we'd talk about the Flash movie again, but that's one thing I really liked about the Flash movie, is that you had, again, Michael Keaton portraying this Batman, and he's saying that Gotham's good. It doesn't need Batman anymore. It's safe. It's a safe place. You can live there now. It's all good to go. That point was already kind of established through Schumacher's style, and even though it's not 100% what he wanted it to be, I don't think he wanted it to be as toy-looking as it wound up being. Like, that was because of the corporate jargon and everything. It still functioned well to show us that Batman's heroics are doing a service to Gotham, after all. And that's another thing. Like, with more of the Schumacher style, this still plays in with the toys a little bit, but you get to the bat suits, you get to all the statues that are everywhere, and those play together as well to also bring in a little bit more of a theme. Like, the bat nipples, even. Like, I'm the first person who's saying that the bat nipples serve as an important thematic purpose within the movie. Because I think it was Schumacher who said that the suits were designed to almost reflect the look of those Greek statues that we're seeing all the time. They're like missing an arm or a head or whatever. And then you're also seeing these giant statues all over Gotham that have been newly erected, that are holding up the giant telescope and everything, creating that bridge that Robin was riding down the arm of on his bike. So you're seeing all these statues, you're seeing these very highly anatomically correct bat suits and Robin suits, and it almost lends to this theme of achievement, legacy, and divinity. Joel Schumacher was using these Greek statue elements in the suits as well as within the city of Gotham itself to create a sense of holiness, of piety, in a sense, that something is being further achieved. Again, playing into that theme of Gotham is becoming cleaner. It's becoming a safer place to be. Almost to the point where it's being romanticized. It's becoming a new safe haven. It's becoming a holy place. It's that safe. And it kind of plays into the end credits song from R. Kelly. We won't talk about R. Kelly, but that song about Gotham City being a good place to live. It is. Like, that's kind of the point of this movie. Like, after this last fight, Gotham's clean. It's no longer as riddled with crime as it used to be. No pun intended with Riddle and Riddler, but anyways. That's my crackpot theory on why the bat nipples work. No, you'll get that from no one else, just here on Player Display. Moving on, again, last real theme with this movie, we already talked a ton about family, so I won't harp on that as much here, but ultimately, it's really about bringing out the best from others, instead of just pushing back and punishing. Like you see, Alfred creating the suit for Batgirl. You see Batman working with Robin and not against him. And you see Batman not punishing Mr. Freeze for what he did, but allowing him the chance to do something good, not just for himself, but also for Alfred and potentially for the entire world, because this ambiguous disease, McGregor syndrome, odds are thousands, maybe millions of other people have it. So it's not just strictly family, but it's also about forgiveness and allowing people to screw up. Allowing Robin to maybe fall off that arm of the statue so he could have the chance to save himself and learn from his own mistakes. And I guess that's where we do see Batman's arc truly come to light, quite literally, because now the sunlight's shining through, when he's talking to Freeze, and he's not berating him, he's not condescending him, he's saying that, yeah, you goofed, you made a mistake, now let's improve from here. That's what he should have done with Robin. And I think when he has his interaction with Freeze, that's when he learns how he should be treating Robin in this family. So, and then also, of course, you've got, Barbara Pennyworth's arc. I think that's her full name at this point. She is also having this realization that Alfred's life isn't hers to control. He chose family because of its values, because of what the members do together as a team. And he demonstrated this by welcoming her into the family with very discreetly, but still with open arms, and building a new suit for her. Technically two, because again, the whole toy thing, you gotta have a nice variant of the suit. So, waiting for McFarlane to make a nice suit as well. But anyways, to wrap up, let's go over the negatives and the positives about this film, just in general. So let's start out with the negatives, because, again, this is a movie. Therefore, it's not perfect. There's still issues with it. I think the first major issue with this movie is there are too many arcs. There are too many themes. It is a movie that is stuffed. It's very crowded. I feel like if certain arcs or characters were sacrificed, then some of the better ones would show a little bit more. Like, again, I feel like as much as I love this Bane, you can remove him completely. He doesn't need to be there. I mean, I guess from a practical standpoint, he gives Ivy some muscle, so he's able to help her renovate the Turkish bath and everything, which is another one of my favorite scenes. But yeah, you remove things like Bane. You could even drop Batgirl, I think, and just focus on Batman and Robin, hence the title of the movie, and remove some characters, remove some arcs. You can have more focus on Mr. Freeze, because I think that's the greatest strong point of this entire movie, his whole arc, and his anti-arc when he becomes the true villain for a time, the true threat. And people would be less talking about the puns and the nipples, and focusing a little bit more on why Mr. Freeze is so great. So, remove some arcs, remove some themes, focus more on what does make the movie so good. Another flaw with this movie, several technically, but bundled into one, is there are a ton of directing and continuity errors. The biggest one that I noticed on my own, I noticed a whole lot more from other analyses on YouTube as well, so I'll mention some of those, but the first one I noticed is after the Bat family puts on the ice suits and defeats Mr. Freeze, they rush back home to give Alfred the cure to McGregor syndrome, and when we pan over to Bruce, he's no longer in his bat suit, fair enough. But then when we pan to Robin and Batgirl no longer has her suit, but Robin is back in his original not ice suit. So that would suggest that after their final fight with Freeze and they finally get the treatment to McGregor syndrome, that would imply they rush back home, Barbara and Bruce take off their suits, but Dick takes off his suit, then puts on his default suit, and then goes in to check in on Alfred. So, yeah, there's some continuity errors. Like, another one, I didn't notice this personally, but someone else did. When Ivy goes into Mr. Freeze's cell in Arkham Asylum, and she's trying to coerce him into teaming up, you know that later in the plot, Bane runs in with the ice suit, in a little cart. But during the scene when Ivy's initially talking to Mr. Freeze, you can actually just see Bane hanging out outside of the door to the cell, which I didn't notice until someone brought it up. And then there are other continuity errors, like how much time did it take for the Bat family to dress up in the ice suits after they defeated Ivy, to then anticipate confronting Mr. Freeze? Like, how long did that take? And then also the fact that Barbara grew up overseas, but she has no British accent. Why does she not have that? Who was raising her? Her parents are dead at this point, but alright, so maybe that one's you could let fly by. Like, maybe she was raised in an orphanage where people had American accents. I don't know. But there are a lot of little film errors, continuity errors, but nothing that shatters the overall narrative. Like, you see them and you're like, ha, that's funny, or ha, that's silly. But it doesn't hurt the movie in any way. Like, for example, in the original Star Wars movie, it's notorious for having well over 200 errors in the film. Whether it be visual or narrative. It's as great of a movie as Star Wars is. It's littered with problems. Like, there's one point where Luke is looking down on Beru in her little home, and there's some little dried up bushes. And then when Luke turns away from Beru, the bushes magically disappear. Little things like that. But it doesn't hurt the story. So there are directing and continuity errors that Joel Schumacher could have caught. Like, simply put, he could have done a second pass over the footage, caught those little things, and chose a different cut to put into the movie, to make it a little bit more clean. But, yeah, you could nitpick at any movie you want. You're always going to find something. There's an error in every single movie. There's no such thing as a perfect one. So, I give that a pass. My only negative with this film, the only thing that I think was poorly done, that was missed opportunity, that I genuinely don't like, is the second to last scene in this movie, where you have all the Bat family together. Alfred's cured, well, at least treated. He's up on his feet. And then Batman, Batgirl, and Robin, they put their hands together. They say they're partners. And then it cuts to their spotlight scene in front of the Bat Signal. My issue with that is Alfred did not put his hand into the pile. Because in his previous dialogues with Bruce, he said that one of his only regrets is that he wished he could have been fighting alongside Bruce. And if he put his hand in there, it wouldn't be implying that, oh yeah, Alfred's gonna go out and fight crime. But again, the whole theme of this movie, or one of its many themes, is family. And Alfred is the father figure to everyone in the Bat family. So for him to put in his hand, it's almost like acknowledging that in the face of his own mortality, he's still a part of this. He's still a Bat family member. So I would have loved if that would have been just a last surprise moment. Like, they all put in their hands, Bruce puts in his hand, then Barbara, then Dick, and then Alfred goes in. Like, unmentioned at all. He just puts in his hand, then you get the crescendo from the score. And then that's the thing that ties up the quadrilogy. Anyone can be a hero. Anyone can be part of this family. I think that would have been a beautiful moment. That should have been so easy to see in a director's chair. I wish they would have done that. I wish Alfred would have gone into that hands together moment. I think that would have been great. Now, obviously, I've gone over a ton of positives already, but let's go through some other ones. The movie's hilarious. I mean, it's an acquired taste of a film. Again, it's a genre film. It's a fantasy film. It depends on what you find funny. Personally, I think the humor is well calculated and in place. Again, it's speaking very much to Adam West. It's speaking to all the movies that came before in some way. So when it comes to the puns, once more, as I said before, it supports Ivy, it supports Mr. Freeze. So, for me, they don't come off as cringe, as it does for a lot of other people. For me, it shows the depth of the characters and what their intentions are. But if you take them on face value, they're still pretty funny. And the movie is also never boring. There's always something happening, there's something good to listen to. The quietest it ever gets is when Bruce is talking with Alfred, and even then you get a lot of really good dialogue. The strongest dialogue in the whole movie, I think. So, there's always something to be laughing at, to be having fun with. It's just a blast. It's a fun movie. if you allow it to be, and you're not too held up by the little things like bat nipples and whatever. If you are, that's fine. It's an acquired taste. Again, for me, bat nipples work because of that whole Greek god, Greek statue thing that Schumacher was going for. Another great thing about this movie is the music, the whole soundtrack. It dates the movie in the best way. You have a lot of 90s tracks from, like, I think Goo Goo Dolls. They did Lazy Eye. That was the track that was playing in the Turkish bath. And at the very end, you have the Smashing Pumpkins doing "The End is the Beginning is the End." And I think it's very underrated what people think about a song that caps off a movie. Like, I think another really good example is in Batman Forever. You had "Kiss from a Rose" from Seal. And that kind of tied together Batman's relationship with Chase Meridian. But I think "The End is the Beginning is the End" is even more thematic, because it's saying, is it bright where you are? Have the people changed? Does it make you happy? You're so strange. And that's speaking to, again, I was talking about like how every character in this movie is in their own isolated, crazy world, but they're all living in the same city. So you're thinking about how all these people changed. Are they better off because of it? And no matter in what direction everyone's going in, whether they're trying to be a hero, or they're a fallen hero, or they're a straight up villain, all of them at the end of the day are strange. Batman's strange because of who he is, his duality between Bruce and the Bat, his inability to hold up a relationship, but his better ability to have adoptive children. As we see, like, in things like the Lego Movie, for example, and in the comics, he has, like, 10 adoptive children. So I think it's a really good cap-off for the film and for the quadrilogy as a whole. And also you have the Elliot Goldenthal soundtrack, which again I think is totally underrated. Very different from the Danny Elfman score, certainly inferior, but it does its own thing very well. Like, I think I heard one source say that the main Batman theme in these two movies, Forever and Batman and Robin, is meant to simulate almost this little tune that a kid would be humming to themselves as they're playing with action figures, which again plays into the toy aspect of this film. And again, that's what this entire movie is. It's a toy commercial, but it works because it complements Schumacher's pre-existing colorful palette for the movie, for his aesthetic. It all does gel together. Even if you think it's a corporate move on Warner Brothers' part, I think it still works for the themes of the movie. So the music all across, whether it's the score or the pop songs, I think all of them are awesome. Definitely check them out if you want, because there's a lot of hidden gems in there. And lastly, it's a nice finale for who was otherwise a static character. Batman in '89 and in Batman Returns was a great archetype, but he wasn't very good as a protagonist. He kind of showed up when he needed to show up, did some cool things, killed a few people here and there, generated some laughs, does the hero's job when it needs to be done. But again, as I mentioned before, there isn't really much of a change in the character. It's only in Batman Forever where we start seeing a change for Bruce Wayne. Like in Batman Forever, you start seeing him question, what is Batman supposed to be? In Batman Forever, he's meant to be a mentor, and he's trying to figure out what's the right way to do this. He's got a totally rogue element being Dick Grayson, and he wants to inform him well. He wants him to become a hero like himself, in spite of them both having the same origin story. Again, the family being killed by a maniac. Oh, I like the sirens in the background. It adds to the atmosphere, but anyways. And then you get an evolution of that in Batman and Robin, where again, he's trying his best to support Dick Grayson, but he's doing it a little bit too much. He's not allowing him to call his own shots, take his own risks. And ultimately, he realizes the value of family and of teamwork and of allowing for some forgiveness. And again, that plays into Mr. Freeze as well. So we finally have a conclusive arc for this Batman that we've been seeing across all 4 films. Again, maybe George Clooney's not your favorite Batman. That's fair. But, again, if you assume that they are all one unified character, this is a good ending for this Batman. The fact that he learns the value of family, he learns that his role as a father is an important one, but he can loosen up. He has to let his children learn for themselves. And that would have played more into a future Batman movie, whether it be Batman Unchained or whatever the working titles were. Maybe Barbara would be making some mistakes later on. And maybe at this point in the game, Batman would be like, you see this mistake you made? Let's learn from this. And that could be the evolution for his character. So, I'm not saying that a sequel to these movies is a requirement. I'm not saying that it left on a cliffhanger. I think it ended just right. But if they wanted to go further, rather, if the audience let them go further, it could have worked. It could have been great. I think there are a lot of themes that were introduced and tied up in the Schumacher movies that could have translated well into sequels, to see the growth of Batman as the family man. That's what I love so much about these movies, and especially about Batman and Robin. So, I think that's all I got to say. I've gone through all my notes here. That's what I wanted to talk about. I just sincerely love this movie, and I hope this podcast helps people to understand why. I don't love it, ironically, as most people do. I don't even say it's a movie that's so bad it's good. I think this movie is sincerely great. It has some outstanding themes. It has really great character moments. I personally love the aesthetics of the movie. I know a lot of people don't. I personally love it. The soundtrack's amazing. I think the acting's great. Because it's meant to be hokey, it's meant to be a giant cartoon. It's a movie that works for me. Again, it's a genre film. It's not supposed to work for everyone. Especially because of, on top of that, it's a sequel and a reboot and a parody. And maybe that doesn't work for most folks, but for me, it functions well. It's strangely great, does a very good job at accomplishing all of these things at the same time, and still fitting into the themes of the movies that came before, and adding at the same time. And I think that's missed because people don't like the general aesthetics and dialogue in the movie. I think the puns throw them off. I think people would prefer Tim Burton, who are used to the Tim Burton aesthetic, are alienated by all the Schumacher colors, by all the extravagant suits, by all the crazy statues that are suddenly built around the city. So, I understand why people dislike the movie. But I don't understand their ability to not look for the good stuff, because it's there. You just have to look past the things that you don't like. And there are some sincerely great elements of this movie. And in my humble opinion, I think this is, in some aspects, better than a lot of the other Batman movies. Like, you could say that the Lego Batman movie does a better job than this movie by doing the whole family thing, but this movie did it first, and it did it pretty well. So, there are elements in here that are very, very good, and while they might not be done to perfection, you've seen them translated into future media where it's been done perfectly. Like, again, as I've said before, if you were to surrender some arcs, get rid of some characters in this movie, Batman and Robin, you'd have a much stronger film. Like, you go to the Lego Batman movie, it focuses more on the family part. And that's why the family element's stronger, because there's not a whole lot of story elements hovering around it that you also have to worry about. So, I think if I'm to point out a single flaw with Batman and Robin, it's just the fact that it's very busy. There's a lot of things going on aesthetically and thematically. And that's the only, true critique that I have about it. I mean, again, you got the Alfred not putting his hand into the hand pile. That's a personal thing, but I think the only genuine issue from a directing standpoint is just the fact that there's too much going on. But I love what is actually going on when they're studied individually. Like, I guess you could say that the parts are greater than the whole, That might be a way to put it. But ultimately, I just love so much of what this movie does. I love how it ties up so many things from the previous movies. And yeah, I sincerely love Batman and Robin. So, anyhow, I could keep going on. I could keep sounding like a broken record, but that's where I stand. Let me know in the comments what you think about this movie. Like, sincerely, what are your honest feelings about Batman and Robin? What is its legacy? How has it informed Batman? Like, do you think this movie exists for the better or for the worse of superhero movies? Like, for me personally, I think that the movies fell backwards after this film because they lost the whimsy, they lost the fantasy. In my opinion, the villains became less complex because Freeze was done so well. Like, I never got too interested in Heath Ledger's Joker because he did a great job and all, but because he didn't really have an origin, he didn't really have a beginning, and he's just chaos and that's it. I can't really connect with the character at all. That's a personal thing. I always love a sympathetic character, a sympathetic villain, more so than one who's just a static archetype. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are as well. If you enjoyed this podcast, you enjoyed ones I've done in the past, and you're hoping for more in the future, then please, as per usual, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, do all that good stuff if you wish. And also, if you have any other ideas for podcasts I could do in the future, then go in the comments and let me know. I'm willing to do them, even if I'm not the most knowledgeable on certain topics, but yeah, I'd be happy to do it. So, anyhow, that's a wrap. Hope you enjoyed, and if you did, do all the good stuff. And no matter what, whether you enjoyed or not, be sure you have a good week. And until we meet again, rock on, and I will see you all later.